There we go. Welcome. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Sarah Sarelson, and I am the Executive Director of the Wyoming Children's Trust Fund and Prevent Child Abuse Wyoming. I have been working in social services, sometimes I say my whole life, but I started as a caseworker in 2008, and since that time have done a variety of different things at Department of Family Services before I started at the Children's Trust Fund in 2020. So it's great to be here with all of you, and this topic is definitely one that is close to my heart. I will let my co-presenter introduce herself.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm Nicole Nieder. I'm the Business Office Coordinator here at the Trust Fund. I previously have worked for the Department of Corrections, the Department of Family Services, and the Wyoming Guardianship Corporation before joining the Trust Fund in 2020. And if everybody wouldn't mind putting your name and where you work, maybe what area of Wyoming you're from in the chat box, we'd love to see where everybody is tuning in from.
So although we can recall and describe with words much of what has happened in our lives, the memory of human experience is stored in our bodies and not just in our minds. Today, we're going to talk about the ACEs study, brain development, epigenetics. We're going to share a little bit of Wyoming data, and then we will wrap up with just a little bit of protective factors. But first, we're going to listen to Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris for just a moment.
In the mid-90s, the CDC and Kaiser Permanente discovered an exposure that dramatically increased the risk for 7 out of 10 of the leading causes of death in the United States. In high doses, it affects brain development, the immune system, hormonal systems, and even the way our DNA is read and transcribed. Folks who are exposed in very high doses have triple the lifetime risk of heart disease and lung cancer, and a 20-year difference in life expectancy. And yet doctors today are not trained in routine screening or treatment. Now, the exposure I'm talking about is not a pesticide or pathogen chemical. It's childhood trauma. Okay, what kind of trauma am I talking about here? I'm not talking about failing a test or losing a basketball game. I am talking about threats that are so severe or pervasive that they literally get under our skin and change our physiology. Things like abuse or neglect, or growing up with a parent who struggles with mental illness or substance dependence. Now, for a long time, I viewed these things in the way I was trained to view them, either as a social problem, refer to social services, or as a mental health problem, refer to mental health services. And then something happened to make me rethink my entire approach.
So many of you know exactly what it is that happened for Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris and has happened for many providers across Wyoming and across the nation. We were able to read the ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. Someone walked into Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris's office and said, "Have you seen this?" and put the study down on her desk. It was developed and co-sponsored by Kaiser Permanente of San Diego, California, and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, Georgia. Dr. Anda, who we've spent a lot of time working with here in Wyoming, designed the ACE study while he was working as a senior scientist at the CDC. He has reviewed and approved all the information from the study that I'll report to you today. The original ACE study was conducted at Kaiser Permanente from 1995 to 1997, with 2 waves of data collection. Over 17,000 health maintenance organization members from the Southern California were receiving physical exams when they completed these confidential surveys regarding their childhood experiences and then current health status and behaviors. So they were all adults. They were between the ages of 19 and 94. Most were college educated, and they all had excellent health insurance at the time. This slide shows the 10 categories of adverse childhood experiences that were studied. First group are indicators of household dysfunction, which include growing up with substance abusing household members, alcohol or drugs, parental separation or divorce, growing up with mentally ill household members or caregivers, witnessing intimate partner violence. This was specifically having a battered mother at the time, or criminal behavior as evidenced by having a household member who was imprisoned. 3 forms of childhood abuse were studied: emotional, physical, and sexual, and 2 forms of neglect were included: emotional and physical. As you can see from the percentages on the slide, ACEs are common in this middle class, well-educated population. ACEs are also highly interrelated. When there was one ACE in the life of a child, 87% of the time, at least one of the other 9 ACEs also occurred. The fact that the 10 different categories of ACEs tend to cluster called for this new way of looking at how ACEs might affect health and social well-being. Because adverse childhood experiences are so highly interrelated, it did not make sense to look at how single categories of ACEs influenced health and social problems. So instead, Doctors Onda and Folletti developed an ACE score. This score is simply a count of the number of categories of ACEs that each person reported, from 0 to 10. Each category counts as 1 point in the ACE score. So if a person experienced physical abuse, no matter how many times or what the severity of the abuse, the ACE score is 1. If the person experienced physical abuse and had a substance abusing parent, the ACE score is 2, and so forth. So we think of the ACE score as a measure of the childhood biological stress dose. As the ACE score goes up, on average, the exposure to the developmental effects of toxic stress also then increases. So in this illustration, you see that only 1/3 of the people in the ACE study had an ACE score of 0. 16% had scores of 4 or more. We're going to talk just a little bit about brain development. The human central nervous system connects us to ourselves, to other people, and to the world around us. The central nervous system consists of the brain and spinal cord that integrate all of our senses and information from receptors located throughout the human body. As we know, it regulates internal body functions and manages very elaborate chemical and electrical signaling. Cells in the nervous system are called neurons. They're stunningly effective at processing and transmitting information, and they have a central purpose in doing so: to adapt in ways that keep us alive. Dr. Martin Teicher of Harvard University has reviewed and approved all of the brain science facts I'm about to show you. On the far left, we see a set of brain cells, or those neurons, and what they might look like at the time of birth. There aren't many connections between these cells at birth. Babies are only born with the connections and brain functions that they need at this point in life. Most of the wiring of our brains occurs as a result of life experience from our senses. By age 6, those same brain cells now have many connections. The wiring of the brain, or the making of complex neural networks, is experience dependent. What gets experienced the most tends to lead to more robust connections between nerve cells that form networks. This process is called branching. The last section of the slide represents age 14, about the time of puberty. Notice that there are now fewer connections between the brain cells that there were at age 6. This is because the least experienced connections tend to withdraw at about the time of puberty. This process is the pruning. This phenomenon helps us to explain why neglect or not getting the experiences we need can have such a powerful negative impact on health and social functioning. One of those elaborate systems is the limbic system. The brain regions in the limbic system control many things, including physical balance, internal temperature, and digestion. The limbic system has an important role in the fight or flight response to danger. The hippocampus and amygdala are two regions in the limbic system that are vital for forming healthy relationships. These areas are the most affected areas of the brain from the emotional trauma. They can make a trauma survivor fearful, especially with events and situations that remind the survivor of their past trauma. Another brain region with seedling cells is the cerebellar vermis, which connects the two halves of the cerebellum. The vermis is also the part of the brain that regulates the release of our feel-good brain chemistry. The vermis is sensitive to all forms of maltreatment just before puberty, and symptoms may not fully emerge until early adulthood. The vermis may be the seat of mental health. It has a role in virtually every mental illness. This includes schizophrenia, borderline personality disorder, and depression. We're only beginning to understand the biological connections between trauma-induced adaptations in the vermis and serious and persistent mental illness. Some brain regions have several periods of sensitivity that span throughout childhood. The corpus callosum is one of these. It's a superhighway that connects the right and the left hemispheres of the brain. Children exposed to various forms of adversity early at life are at an increased risk for a broad range of developmental difficulties, affecting both cognitive and emotional adjustment. People who report higher ACE scores are more likely to have health and social problems. We know that as the ACE score goes up, the percentage of people with health and social problems also goes up. We call this that dose-response relationship. You know dose response, the more gas you put into your car, the more miles you can drive. In this case, where there's a higher dose of adverse childhood experiences, the higher the percentage of people with health problems. All of the data slides from the ACE study that I'll show you today are formatted in this same way. Along the bottom horizontal axis is the ACE score from 0 on the left or to 4 or more on the right. The vertical is the percent of people who have the disease or condition. So in the first set of bars on the far left, we see that the percent of people who became regular cigarette smokers by the age of 12 goes up as each level of the ACE score goes up. In the second set of bars, we see the percent who were smokers as adults also goes up in a stepwise fashion as the score goes from 0 to 4 or more. People with higher ACE scores have increased risk of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or COPD. About 4% of people with an ACE score of 0 develop COPD, while more than double that percent of people, about 9%, with an ACE score of 4 or more develop COPD. ACEs led to early onset of smoking, which is then sustained through adulthood and eventually then leads to a high risk of smoking-related lung disease. So now we begin to anticipate why ACEs are related to certain behaviors and social conditions. Here we see the risk of becoming an alcoholic increases 6-fold from an ACE score of 0 to a score of 6. As ACEs affect relationships, people with higher ACE scores are more likely to marry an alcoholic. Think about it for a minute, how these indicate how ACEs tend to then be transmitted from one generation to the next. Depression is the leading cause of disability in developed countries. Here we see that the risk of depression increases for both men and women in a dose-response fashion as the ACE score goes up. ACEs are held in the body, leading to mental, physical, behavioral health problems in adulthood. Some of those problems are then unintentionally handed to the next generation. Becoming an alcoholic, marrying an alcoholic, and suffering from depression are all part of the intergenerational transmission of ACEs. Increasingly, research seems to bear out the fact that toxic stress of ACEs might not only be experienced by the individual, but could also be transmitted from one generation to the next at a genetic level. In very simplified terms, it may be possible to pass on trauma to our children and grandchildren, making the implications of ACEs more devastating and far-reaching than we had ever imagined. Some researchers who have studied historic periods of trauma, like the American Civil War or the Holocaust, now suspect that abuse, neglect, deprivation, and trauma can impair the functioning at some level of future generations who may not be living in the same adverse circumstances. Epigenetics. So epigenetics is the study of cellular and physiological phenotype trait variations that are caused by external or environmental factors that switch genes on and off and affect how cells read genes instead of being caused by changes in the DNA sequence. So what this means that while the field of genetics looks at the expression of the genetic code, epigenetics studies factors that influence the expression of the gene. Research in the area of epigenetics has concluded that during early life, the environment we live in can affect the way that our genes are expressed. So environmental factors like security, bonding, and love can alter how our genes switch on or switch off, or how they simply operate. Differing genetic expressions can occur without causing any changes to the underlying genes themselves. The environment we experience, especially when we are young, can affect which of our genes are active or expressed and which remain dormant or unexpressed. Epigenetics is a newer scientific field that explains how experience gets under our skin. Our genes are contained in the DNA of our cells. Genes provide instructions for cells to become specialized into liver cells, heart cells, and so forth. They also contain the keys to the disease and well-being throughout the life course. Epigenetics tells us about the ways that the instructions on our genes are used. So to understand epigenetics, it's important that we understand just a little bit about how DNA is organized. So think of a long strand of fishing line, many yards of it. In order to fish without the line being tangled or disorganized, the fisherman puts the line on a reel so that the line then can be let out, brought back in. So similar of how we do it with an actual fishing pole, think about how that is set up. We have thousands of genes. So our long strands of DNA are tightly condensed into the chromosomes in the nucleus of our cells. Looking more closely like the fishing line on the reel, the DNA is tightly wrapped around protein balls called histones. Epigenetics involves the attachment of chemicals, represented by the orange cylinder in the diagram, to those DNA at a particular gene. The attachment of that chemical can prevent the gene's message from being available to be read. Other types of chemical attachments can cause the gene to be open, so the instructions can be read by the cells. So that's the turning on and turning off. Here is where this is relevant to ACEs. New research suggests that stressful experiences can influence these chemical attachments that influence the reading of our genetic code in ways that can have negative effects on our cells and how they function. This may be an important reason why ACEs are related to so many health and social problems. But there's hope. The hopeful part of this is that other types of positive life experiences may also affect the reading of our genes, and that may reverse the negative effects of ACEs or have positive effect on human development, health, and well-being. Our brains are continuously making predictions. When we hear a rustling noise, or the wind blowing through nearby branches, we have to determine whether the noise is a wild animal or it's just the wind. Our past experiences shape our brain's predictions of current experiences. Those sights, smells, or the meanings we have made from a similar past experience will affect our expectations. If you've experienced happy days when you smell sweet cherry blossoms hung in the air in the spring, then the smell of cherry blossoms may activate brain predictions of another happy day. But if on the same type of day you had a frightening experience, when you smell cherry blossoms, your brain would predict something scary could happen next. Amazingly, some brain predictions can be passed down from generation to generation. In one study, Epigenetics conditioned laboratory rats to be afraid of the smell of cherry blossoms. When the cherry blossom odor came into the rat's environment, they huddled together, stunned with fear until the odor was removed. These rats then had babies, pups, who grew up without any exposure to cherry blossoms. This generation of rats were then separated from their parents and placed into a different environment. When the smell of cherry blossoms was put into their environment of the babies who had never been around cherry blossoms, the rats were jumpy. They had heightened sensitivity to the smell of cherry blossoms. The response to the smell of cherry blossoms had been passed down onto the pups by their epigenetic markers. So why might this be a good thing for sensitivity or fear to be passed down from one generation to another? Why might it be a good thing for the rats to feel fear, even when no one instructed them to fear cherry blossoms? Survival. Fear can and does protect us as a species from dangerous situations or toxins. It may be adaptive for that fear to be then passed down from one generation to the next if it would then prevent poisoning or avoid dangers. The field of epigenetics may help us to understand how groups of people may be deeply affected by historical trauma when the epigenetic response from our parents or ancestors can be passed on to future generations, passed on to us. This can happen despite efforts to care for one another well. So how do we heal the wounds of our ancestors? We don't fully know the answer to that question, but we do know that we are the ones responsible today because we are the adults and no one is waiting in the wings. So let's think about this as the positive side of experience being passed down from one generation to the next. Scientists are testing whether positive characteristics like nurturing behavior can be inherited from one's parents and grandparents. The field of epigenetics provides us with hope that our way of relating to one another can create lasting positive changes in genetic expression. It's how creating healing communities now can lay an enduring path of generational healing and recovery.
And so now we are going to talk a little bit about Wyoming-specific data related to ACEs. So in 2020, Wyoming surveyed a sample of adults on their experiences with ACEs before they turned the age of 18, and then compared these numbers to the surveys taken in 25 other states. So as you can see from the graph on the slide, 19.4% of Wyoming adults had experienced 4 or more ACEs before they were 18 years old. And this is compared to 15.6% of the adults that were surveyed in the 25 other states. So the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System, otherwise known as the BRFIS, because that name is a little bit of a tongue twister, is the nation's premier system of health-related telephone surveys that collects state data about U.S. residents regarding their health-related risk behaviors, chronic health conditions, and the use of preventative services. This was established in 1984 with 15 states, and the BRFIS now collects data in all 50 states, as well as the District of Columbia and 3 U.S. territories. And if you want to scan the QR code on this slide, it will take you to the report from the study that we're about to discuss. And for this report, the data was collected between 2015 and 2017. So if we take a look at the percentage on this slide, over half the adults surveyed in 25 states have reported experiencing at least one type of an ACE. Think about that in terms of the people that you work with, maybe the families that you help, and those who are in your personal lives. ACEs affects people directly and indirectly due to the likelihood of you knowing someone with an ACE score. So among Wyoming adult residents, the highest number of ACEs occurred in those who were aged 18 to 24 years old, those who are Native American, and those with an annual income under $15,000, those without a high school diploma, and those who are unable to work. So those with the higher ACE scores also tended to report higher levels of risk factors such as smoking, obesity, depression, and diabetes. Now, according to the data collected during the 2020 Wyoming BRFIS, information provided by adults reporting on their mental health, which includes their stress levels, feelings of depression, and problems with their emotions, reported their mental health was not good 14 or more of the days in the past 30 days. And as you can see on this slide, the risk factors reported are higher among those who have experienced past sexual abuse. Now, some key numbers in Wyoming are that 27% of Wyoming households live below the 200% federal poverty rate. The maternal mortality rate in Wyoming is on the rise, and 8.9% of Wyoming children do not have health insurance. So our goal should be healing the effects of childhood trauma now so that even the possibility of passing it on to future generations is minimized. As a community, let's focus on trying to achieve that goal.
What I had thought of as simply best clinical practice, I now understand to be a movement. In the words of Dr. Robert Block, the former president of the American Academy of Pediatrics, adverse childhood experiences are the single greatest unaddressed public health threat facing our nation today. And for a lot of people, that's a terrifying prospect. The scope and scale of the problem seems so large that it feels overwhelming to think about how we might approach it. But for me, that's actually where the hope lies.
So as Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris was talking about, By preventing ACEs in children, we can potentially reduce the risk factors when they are adults, such as pulmonary disease, heart disease, obesity, and depressive disorders. So how do we put all this together to make a case for understanding ACEs as a powerful pathway to health and well-being? Now that we understand that ACEs are common and they have a strong cumulative impact on the risk of common health and social problems, preventing ACEs and their intergenerational transmission is the greatest opportunity for improving the well-being of human populations. In fact, the ACE study team and ACE interface believe this is the greatest opportunity of our time. So this slide shows the percentage of various health and social problems that epidemiologists estimate are caused by ACEs. The calculation that is commonly used to do this in public health studies is the population attributable risk. This is displayed as a percentage as an oil spill on the slide. The percentage of the problem that is coded in the oil spill represents the percentage of each problem that is potentially preventable by preventing ACEs. So as you can see, the percentages are quite large. And in fact, the high percentages on this chart are rarely seen in public health studies. The cumulative effects of ACEs reflect a powerful opportunity for prevention. No matter if you are working to prevent heart disease or cancer, to end homelessness or hopelessness, or to improve business profitability, as we align a portion of our work around a common goal of preventing the accumulation of ACEs and moderating their effects, we will reduce all of these problems and many others all at once. The ACE study provides us with straightforward information about the consequences of toxic stress during childhood. This scientific research gives us powerful information we can use every day to improve the health, safety, prosperity, and longevity. But the ACE study isn't a detailed roadmap of services or programs. It's an invitation for all of us to get to be the pioneers. This news is simply too important to wait for someone else to design that detailed roadmap. Through our collective knowledge and action, we are the ones with the power to shift the dynamics within our own families, our communities, and society that lead to high ACE scores. Our culture has built separate systems and ways of thinking about health and social problems. This way of doing business in society is sometimes called a siloed approach. Each silo has its own budget, own training, and mental model about preventing and treating the individual types of problems that is that focus. The ACE study and the knowledge about their effects on brain structure and function now show us that viewing health and social problems as separate issues is an illusion. It's an illusion based upon outdated mental models. Now, we know that many common health and social problems have a common cause based upon the powerful impact of ACEs throughout the life course. We used to talk about breaking down silos, but that's not really practical because human nature and the organizational behavior is such that the budgets and priorities in siloed systems are too well defended. But the good news is that none of us has to stop working on the issues we are passionate about. If we simply add a thread to our work that's focused on preventing the accumulation of ACEs, that common thread will connect and align all of our work in powerful ways. When we hear about the ACE study findings, people often ask about resilience. People get excited about the notion of resilience, in part because it reminds us that our supportive actions do matter. Our desire for resilience leads naturally to a search for ways to help families and communities. 3 protective systems interact and guide positive adaptation. These powerful systems are individual capabilities, attachment and belonging with a caring and competent person, and protective community, faith, and cultural processes. So what do we know about individuals who do well despite adversity? We know that the 3 protective systems are nested. People do best when they are living in thriving families and communities. We can help one another to develop personal attributes that help us all weather life storms. Personal attributes like positive view of one's life, self-efficacy, and self-regulation are all discussed at length in the resilience literature. So we're going to briefly go through the 5 protective factors. First, there's parental resilience. This is having the tools to manage stressful situations and the parents responding to those situations. This is the ability to overcome difficult experiences as well as learn from those experiences and build their own resilience. Social connections is developing positive relationships that in turn can offer support, provide a safe space for parents to discuss difficult situations or parenting strategies, and a positive relationship so parents know they are not alone. Knowledge of parenting and child development is parents understanding their child's development and having realistic expectations of what their child is capable of at that level. This is also beneficial for parents understanding their role in their child's physical, cognitive, language, and social and emotional development. Concrete support in times of need is having access to concrete supports or services to address the family's needs as to reduce their stress levels. It's important as some families don't know what's available or even understand what they need to ask for. Some families just don't know what they're missing or what they can be in need of help with. Lastly, it's social and emotional competence of children. And this is family and child interactions that help children to develop the ability to communicate clearly, recognize and regulate their emotions, and establish and maintain relationships. We can add to the positive side of the resilience scale by piling on the positive experiences, especially through responsive relationships. The one thing that most children who develop resilience have in common is a stable, committed relationship with a supportive parent, a caregiver, or another adult. Adults need these supportive relationships also. So during a crisis like the COVID-19 outbreak, families needed their immediate basic needs met before they could focus on anything else. And culture is an umbrella term that encompasses the collective social behavior, institutions, and norms found in human societies, which include the collective knowledge, beliefs, arts, laws, customs, capabilities, and habits of the individuals in these groups. As you can see on the iceberg on the slide, the surface culture, or the things that we can easily see, are very few compared to the deep culture that we all have as individuals. And as we consider each protective factor, we'll have you consider a few questions. So think about, how does culture impact families as they seek to build protective factors? How does your own culture shape how you feel or think or behave? And how do differences in culture impact helping others build protective factors? And thank you, Sarah, for dropping those in the chat so everybody can review those and think about them. Now, cultural safety is the ultimate goal when working with families, so they feel seen and heard. To achieve this goal, we first need to be culturally aware. Understanding the difference between your own culture and those who have a different culture from your own, it's important to remember the differences in attitudes and values. Be culturally sensitive by being aware of cultural differences, by not judging those with different cultures. Educate yourself and your understanding of cultural trauma. As seen on the previous slide, what may show on the surface in today's world can just be the tip of the iceberg to a culture, but culture goes back many generations, and things that have historically have been traumatic can evolve over time to become cultural today. And lastly, commit to self-evaluation. Be aware of and understand the power imbalances that are present in the work you may do. Using these 3 strategies will create a culturally safe environment for families where they are free to express their own cultures, as well as feeling seen and heard, that in turn will create a safe space for children and families. And like in any culture, it's impossible to fully understand another person's culture unless you have lived in that culture with all the differences and experience all the finer details. And it's okay to admit that you don't know everything. It's an opportunity to learn something new and to show respect for a different culture from your own. Now, there is a predictable pattern to transformative change. It begins with discovery and communication, which leads people to clarify their values and thinking. With new knowledge and new habits of thinking, people change the actions they take in everyday life. The collective actions of many people shape a new reality that is ratified in organizational and policy change. The truth is that people create a new reality long before new laws are passed. Change is up to us. It's shaped by our thoughts, our conversations, the way we relate with one another in relationships, in families, and in communities. As we work to prevent the accumulation of ACEs, let's keep in mind that we don't have to get ACE scores to 0. Bringing scores down any amount will have huge effects. We might not be able to prevent a first ACE from occurring in a family, but we certainly can notice when children have 5 ACEs and make sure that number doesn't go to 10. As we thread through all of our work and new focus of supporting adults, particularly adults who, through no fault of their own, experienced many ACEs when they were children, we will prevent ACEs for the next generation. We live at a time of great hope and promise. The largest public health discovery of our time is about family, community, children, and it's about us. Our action to prevent ACEs, whether large or small, can profoundly improve our future. And if you wouldn't mind scanning the QR code on the slide and responding to that, just to let us know how we did. This concludes our presentation. We do have one more short video for you, but I hope everybody has a great day, and thank you for spending your lunch hour with us.
We have a beautiful little boy named Bronson. I have no idea how we got so lucky, but he's just such an awesome little dude. We're actually excited to be parenting him different than how we were kind of raised growing up in certain capacities. Growing up, my dad, he just wanted to work on the railroad and then come home and drink every day. I wanted to hang out with him a bunch, but it always seemed like it was taking away from his time to drink.
When my mom was pregnant with me, my dad was like pushing 50 and decided to stop drinking. And prior to that, he was, a chronic, alcoholic. And so I grew up in a sober house, but with parents who didn't talk about it. I didn't know how to have a healthy relationship with alcohol or with anything because it was really presented to me like anybody who drinks regularly has a problem.
I went to treatment the first time in 2017, relapsed in like 3 or 4 weeks after I got out.
So he went to rehab again a year later. And during that period of time, I did a ton of reading and researching, and it changed my whole career. I ended up working in substance abuse and mental health treatment.
I knew 100% that she was in my corner.
And so embarking on the learning process together kept us on the same page with the same vocabulary. So it wasn't until, we were in our healthy, balanced life that we were ready to have kids.
And with our son, anything that he does, I want to support him. I don't care what it is. Basically reinforcing the support that I need to have.
Your parents can have done the best that they could, but that doesn't mean they didn't traumatize you. But we have to be honest about these things to stop repeating them.